Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. Before we jump into this week's episode with Mike Forenza, an incredible conversation about sustainability in the cannabis industry, just a point of clarity. I don't know if it's a point of clarity, a little bit of housekeeping before I do the housekeeping in the episode, but we're moving to every other week. We're down on human resources a little bit, and we're looking for a little bit of sponsorship support. So in the event that anyone's interested in sponsoring the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, please reach out to me, David at cannabisequipmentnews.com. Any kind of help can really go a long way in helping this thing keep going. It's been a great 4 years, and hope we can keep this thing, hope we can just keep this thing on the air. Is it even on the air anymore? On the wire? On the internet? In the cloud? It's in the cloud now. Anyway, all right, hang tight. Great conversation with Mike Forenza coming up. Check it out now.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Mike Forenza, managing partner of AE Global. Thank you very much for joining me today, Mike.
David, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Mike, I always like to start with a little bit of background. So, how did you find yourself working in the cannabis industry?
A good question. So we started in industrial packaging. If you've ever seen a Uline catalog, we started as a distributor of those type of products in South Florida mainly. We ended up getting introduced to Columbia Care, the first MSO we started working with just through, some shared connections there. And that was kind of our, I would say, aha moment. This was in late 2016, early 2017, of just how, fast moving that industry was and how much opportunity there was to provide supply chain solutions to companies that were, trying to grow at breakneck speeds. So we really kind of fell into it, without trying to get into the cannabis industry, but, through, just understanding the nuances of a new bludgeoning industry.
Was that aha moment because it was underserved, or just that you found that you had a particularly strong position in it?
I think underserved for sure. Prior to, the cannabis industry in general, you can't think of too many new multi-billion-dollar CPG, verticals that just pop out of nowhere. So really what you had was a ton of capital coming in. Everybody was really, in a race to grab market share. And so when you're a MSO that's got a ton of money and you're trying to grow in 20 new markets and launch new brands, there's nobody that was really equipped from a packaging perspective to support the industry the way that, the investors were hoping to see the growth. So for us, it was really navigating our way to the right procurement and marketing teams and understanding, what they were up against for expectations. And then for us, it was really building a domestic supply chain back in 2017 that could service really the speed to market that everybody was looking for.
Is that why you needed to build the domestic supply chain, just simple time to market?
That was it for us. In hindsight, we're looking, from our business model, we were always a domestic first manufacturer. And it wasn't because we had a crystal ball and seeing the, current geopolitical scenarios playing out right now. Everything was just, how do we deliver custom packaging to people in under 4 weeks? But, realistically, people were looking for even under 2 weeks in a lot of occasions. So without having a domestic, manufacturing base that had the appetite for that, we were never going to be in a position to succeed. So, I would say our fortunate timing and the opportunity to serve the industry at that moment really, forced us to go find, single owner facilities. A lot of times they're run by the person who started them, people that were willing to break the normal packaging model of, everything's 12 to 16 weeks and you got to plan out 2 quarters ahead. We really focused on finding smaller regional manufacturers that had the appetite to, deal with what the insanity of the cannabis industry still is.
Were most of those regional manufacturers on board with serving that industry?
The short answer is no. You'd be surprised. Depending on the ownership structure and people's beliefs on the plant in general, we'd run into a company that would seem, in our opinion, oh wow, you would be the best fit for servicing this industry. It might be a company that did flexible packaging, labels, folding cartons, all under one roof. But you'd end up starting talking to a sales contact there, and even though we're not plant touching anything that has cannabis on it, you sometimes run into less nowadays, but you still will run into companies that just say, "Hey, we just can't touch it. We won't touch it." So there that added complexity, even outside of the banking world, you still see some stigma around it.
So, with a 2 week lead time, it not only had to be domestic, but did it have to be fairly regional?
Yeah, ironically, shipping is less important. Finding a quick turn, folding carton manufacturer, let's say in California, if you find the right facility that's willing to do stuff that quickly, again, this is going back years, there was an appetite for air freighting everything. If you can manufacture something in 7 days and have it land in 10, you were way ahead of the game compared to most people. Now, the caveat to all this is, us now, you never really want to sell speed, right? When you're selling speed, things break, quality isn't the same. We grew in that area and we really made that part of our identity early on. But, in the last years, as we've kind of grown up and the industry's grown up, demand planning and trying to be a little bit more deliberate with your dollars and really thinking things through is, I would say, probably one of the most important, pivots that we've seen in the industry.
Well, I think that follows the natural trajectory of any sort of upstart industry or company, like be fast and first and better, and then mature appropriately, right?
Yep. Yep, absolutely.
So, what was the first couple of years like navigating the industry, like 2016, 2017, and how has it evolved over the years?
I would say the biggest difference, well, there's a lot of differences, but navigating in those times, we were, again, we didn't have a crystal ball, but we just didn't have the bandwidth to have 500 different customers. And if you think back on a lot of the early cannabis packaging companies or companies that focused on the cannabis industry, a lot of them went to market with catalogs, and they were, we even went public, and they're trying to service, 2,000 to 4,000 customers at any given time when all these new cannabis companies kind of came about. And it wasn't that we didn't want more customers, but we just didn't have the bandwidth to service in the way that we wanted to a large customer base. So by that, we ended up really focusing on a smaller group of customers that were some of the larger, or what now have turned into be some of the larger MSOs. So for us, our focus then and still now is we really try to be as diverse in what our product offering is to a smaller group of customers, rather than having the entire industry potentially be buying stock items out of a product catalog. So I would say that the largest risk factor is people run out of money. And if you're servicing the industry as a whole, I think you've seen a lot of the people that are on the lower half of the capital market structure, just, they're just kind of disappearing, which is sad.
Was that difficult? Has that been difficult, scaling methodically, being a little bit more careful and calculated rather than, kind of trying to bite off more than you could chew?
Yeah, we've been fortunate as well as, a lot of companies that were servicing the cannabis industry that were packaging focused that, like I said, might have had a larger demographic of customers that ended up kind of fading away. We've ended up being fortunate to find what I believe is some of the best cannabis packaging salespeople and just product knowledge people that still have an appetite to serve in this industry. So for us, the scaling methodically was really more of a result of finding some really high quality human resources that came from some of our competitors that no longer kind of exist the same way that they did. And so just through that, in this industry, I think it's extremely important to know who you're doing business, and it's really hard to judge a book by its cover. And so when you end up having a lot of people that have 4 or 5 years of cannabis packaging experience, you can kind of grow by they're focusing on who their good customers were at their last stop. And so we really try to make sure that if we're putting time, effort, and energy into servicing one of these customers, that they're one, a demographic of person you want to deal with, but two, hopefully have enough capital to pay their bills at some point in time.
Well, and it's easy to attract or allure a really good candidate, but to hold on to the talent is difficult as well. How have you guys managed turnover, and what are some of the things that works for AE Global when it comes to hanging on to that quality talent?
We've been, again, I think, fortunate in the sense that we haven't really had much turnover. We've been very selective about, hiring and who we bring on. And, I would say the good and the bad about this packaging industry, what I sometimes joke about, is that it's kind of a crummy industry. You're mostly dealing with a million layers of complexity that more often than not, you're not in control of, right? Unless you're a direct manufacturer of something and you're sitting at the machine making whatever product this is. If you're where we sit in the supply chain, you're dealing with hundreds of different vendors, a million different ways for things to go wrong. In the packaging industry as a whole, you have 1% of failure rates, and it might seem like every single day you're dealing with something else going sideways. So the short answer on all of this is we have so much going on a daily basis. And I think the salespeople that come on, or the project managers, or even people from our innovation lab, there is so much work going on that you almost, the culture is very focused on get stuff done, customer first. And because there is so many transactions, I think it's a pretty enjoyable area of the industry to work in, especially because more often than not, you're doing something new every day.
With the idea of it being sort of a difficult or crummy industry, in your opinion, is there a crisis in cannabis packaging?
I would say, it depends on which lens. I would say the industry is forced to overpackage a lot. I think if you look at the state by state regulations and how often they change, it allows for, no economies of scale on an annual basis. You can't make buying decisions about your packaging because Ohio might decide you need a new symbol on everything and they don't want stickers. So I think the inherent, constant change in the industry that makes almost every aspect of the cannabis industry a crisis. Packaging is no different. At the same time, I believe that there's a ton of product integrity issues that the industry still has to figure out: shelf life preservation, THC degradation. There's almost so many different crises that it's almost like, what difference does it make? Like, you can only focus on so many things going sideways at once, to where it's just, you might as well just have your head down and you're doing what you're doing to begin with.
Well, and a lot of those are inherent with sort of it's not nascent anymore, but a young industry. With some of those critical issues, which ones do you think are the most important to focus on first? Is it shelf stability?
I would say that as the industry matures, truth in labeling is one of the biggest factors, right? So if and cannabis is a weird product where you can't, if you're just talking about THC percentage, right? If you put way too much THC into a package and have to label it lower than what it is, because the half-life of that THC degradation is going to be an issue for labeling laws, somebody might get a package and it's going to be too hot, right? So you've got a complaint when there's too much of the active ingredient. Then on the flip side, there's not enough, modified atmosphere packaging, in the industry, to where that they can control the plant to know that, hey, in 60 days, if you say that this is a 25% THC product, if it's not within 10 to 15% of that when somebody opens that package, there's going to be major ramifications at some point in time when, the class action lawyers get involved and people see opportunities to say that, the consumers weren't sold what they thought they were. So to me, long term, I feel like that is something the industry is going to have to address, and it's going to be, I think, one of the more painful you know, problems to solve because of how technical it is, and it's an equipment, and really a gas flushing type of automation piece of equipment you would need to achieve that.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more precisely what modified atmosphere packaging is?
So it's a package where you're controlling the atmosphere inside of it, right? So think of baby formula. You can think of, any type of fresh cut produce. Those are typically in modified atmosphere packages, right? If you buy lettuce at the grocery store, they might have certain micro perforations on the lidding film to allow the proper oxygen to escape, but the proper gases to come in to extend the shelf life of that fresh cut produce. Cannabis really, if you're trying to freeze and I use the word freeze, but if you're trying to keep the product in its exact state of when it's packaged, it really needs to be in a zero oxygen environment and zero light, so that there's no degradation to the active product. So what that requires is either on a bag some sort of gas flush and a seal, or on a rigid container. It's the same thing with maybe a similar heat induction liner, but there's some science that's required, and some real product stability testing that goes into it. If this was going to be any type of snack food or nutraceutical with an active ingredient, this is what those industries already deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and ideally that's where we're headed, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think when you look at the state of the industry, there's a couple things that end up becoming really hard to have be the top focus. Sustainability is one, right? If people don't have money, it's really hard to think of a sustainability initiative on your packaging if you're already struggling to stay alive. Product integrity and consumer safety, it's one of these issues that if companies aren't necessarily forced to adhere to anything, they're going to do whatever the guidelines are in their state to be as competitive as they can to stay alive. So, while I do think the industry is heading there, I think there's so much legislation that needs to happen, whether it's at the federal level or at individual state levels, for the bureaucrats to even really understand, what is best for the consumer, what is even, best for the consumer, but still viable for the industry. It's not a simple answer.
When it comes to the regulatory side, it isn't a simple answer. We've been talking to regulators, particularly when it comes to packaging, where it's just like, hey, at the base level, why can't we get this one thing right? Where we're talking about the opposite, between like 12 SKUs and 120 SKUs. And it's crazy that from a regulatory perspective, their hands are essentially tied, right? Because they have to go by the letter of the law.
Correct. And I think, when you're looking at where there is some issue, it's really systemic in the sense you've set up every state's their own little economy. Every state's got their own cannabis control commission, board, whatever you want to call it. If these people aren't making changes, right? If they come in and, if you hire a cannabis control board, and let's just say that, let's just make it up and say that New Jersey has the best, structure for a cannabis state, right? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It doesn't really matter. If New York just copies what New Jersey does, you've got these people in power that, okay, well, did you really do anything? And I think there's a lot of, hey, if I'm not putting my own stamp on this, if, whether you look at Ohio, Missouri, everybody comes out with a new symbol, right? Why? Like every state doesn't need a new symbol, but every state that is given some autonomy to make decisions, they're making decisions that are relevant to their state. And they're saying, look at what the Cannabis Control Board did. I don't know if that could be a pretty generalized thing, but I can't think of any other reason why you would have multiple symbols in multiple states other than just somebody who had the ability to make the decision decided, I want to be different to show you what I did.
Right. Like just a lot of people on control boards that have some sort of child that is a graphic artist looking for an opportunity.
That could be. There's a lot of money in making new symbols. Unfortunately, just
really
sucks all the money out of the cannabis companies.
Is there really money in making a new cannabis symbol for labeling?
I joke. It depends where you are in the supply chain, right? If you're a label printer, it's great because every time they change it, everybody's relabeling over their existing symbols, right? This has happened. Certain states have decided, hey, this was our old symbol. We're going to make a new symbol. Well, and tell everybody that the packaging is now out of spec at a certain date and they got to relabel it. It's kind of a joke.
Well, I think that it would be, for a regulator to come out and just say, hey, this other state is doing it right and we're just going to copy them? I don't know. I think it would set an incredible precedent for the industry going forward.
I would 100% agree. I think the biggest issue there is I don't think you could point to any one state right now and say that they exactly got it, So everybody is looking, if you could have somebody in New York point to Florida and say, well, look, they created an oligarchy of a system down there, and that's not good. You could have Florida looking at New York and be like, they let 1,500, there's no rules up there. Nobody can do business, right? They're both right, right? And so depending on the lens, both people are right at the same time. And so I think that I think we're far from seeing any one state kind of check every box appropriately.
So, in your lens, which state is the closest to getting it right?
I would say, I mean, it's tough because it depends who you're at, right? It depends who you're asking. If you're asking, about the financial health of the cannabis companies, I'd say it'd probably be hard to say Florida is not the right market. Now, does that mean that Florida is the best market for the consumer in the sense of product differentiation, availability, and all that other stuff? The answer there is probably no. Is it good in the sense that people know exactly who's manufacturing the product and selling it in their own retail stores? Like, yeah, there's some positives there. I would say from our standpoint, Florida has been the best to service. One, because the rules have, in the last 2 or 3 years, they've stayed relatively the same from a packaging standpoint. The customer base that we support here seems, at least in just this market, seems to be financially viable. I wouldn't say financially amazing, but it seems viable more so than other markets.
How frequently are these labeling and packaging changes happening state to state? I mean, is it happening every 1 to 2 years?
So, I mean, if you're talking about the big players, the Trulieve, Cresco, GTI, Verano, the guys that touch 15 markets, 10 markets, whatever it is, they're dealing with it every year because one of the markets is dealing with it every year. And every one of them are, almost, unless you wanted to have packaging that all is white and relatively boring, you can't have packaging in every market because Florida's got the most stringent, rules around what the aesthetics can be. And so everybody tends to have different packaging in each market. You try to get some economies of scale, and you might have, for one brand, 3 or 4 different designs that can work in 10 different markets. But the problem is that if you're in most of these legal markets, every single year, there's something changing packaging wise every year, without a doubt. So the drain on resources, redoing artwork files, like it's nonstop, change.
Well, I mean, we talk about sustainability in packaging, and it sounds like the most sustainable thing to do right now is to just do the same thing year over year.
To me, if you wanted to solve a massive sustainability issue in the cannabis space, the first thing would be I don't think you'd need to require child-resistant packaging for flower products. You're talking pre-rolls and whatever else. So you've got some over-packaging being done because of flower. And then there has to be, the states have to get together to align on a single symbol, right? If it doesn't, a state might, Florida might say, hey, we're gonna, we don't want very colorful packaging, and that's fine. But if everybody just aligned on the one single symbol, so as long as that was going to be the same, you could still have a couple variations here or there. But to me, from a sustainability standpoint, those two things would make massive, massive implications for just getting rid of waste, because people throw away a ton of packaging today, just because of compliance.
Well, getting into the sustainability side of the packaging industry, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your recently announced expanded partnership with Repurpose Global. Could you talk us through that a little bit and what it means for AE Global?
Yep. So Repurpose Global is a plastic action organization. I think they would call themselves that. It's a new demographic of, for-profit companies that are really, setting out to inspire brands to make in capital contributions to their organization, and then they go out to the most at-risk areas of the world that have no waste management infrastructure and help kind of create mini businesses there that employ the local community, pay people to collect waste, and then figure out a different end of life scenario for a lot of low value materials that would normally end up in waterways. So from, AE Global's perspective, sustainability, not only in the cannabis industry, but every industry, it's a conversation. It's top of mind. What are you doing about sustainability is a question that we were always asked. We were never truly comfortable picking a, material science answer of saying, hey, we're making our push into biodegradable plastic, into compostable materials, into you name it, whatever the flavor of the week or what seemed to be the new magic buzzword. We weren't so confident that whatever we were going to make as a position, if it had a material around it being truly sustainable. It's just very hard to prove, and you could usually find two people on whatever side of the aisle that would say, hey, your tin can, for example, has a bigger carbon footprint than your plastic container. And the plastic container people might say, hey, the glass container that you have is not infinitely recyclable and plastic's better. So that there's a debate that you constantly will have around what materials people are using and how sustainable they are. So we really wanted to make a concerted effort to say that AE Global's sustainability initiative was going to be really helping fund waste management infrastructure. So we actually, prior to our partnership with Repurpose Global, we invested and formed the first ocean-bound recycling facility in the Dominican Republic. It's called Ocean Recovery Group. Our goal there and what we were set out to do was collect, somewhat of low-grade materials, chop them up, flake them, bring them back, and make some of our child-resistant packaging here in the States out of this material. Is that, moving the needle on the plastic waste crisis? No, but really our thesis was more around getting brands and our customers to support companies like Repurpose Global and having us kind of be the conduit to help them do that. So right now, we are the official packaging partner of Repurpose Global, and our goal is to engage with as many of our customers, cannabis specific or not, really helping them understand what their plastic footprint is. So it's looking at every single item that they're putting into the ecosystem and figuring out what the cost would be for them to offset that through this partnership with Repurpose Global. So in the simplest of ways to think about it, it's kind of like a 1% for the planet or a Tom's Shoes model, where if we help a brand hopefully save some money on packaging cost or overall supply chain costs and then help them redirect it to this group, they can make the claim that their product line is either plastic neutral or negative, which would be collecting 2x the amount of waste that they're putting into the system.
Well, and I wouldn't sell yourself so short. I mean, you say that it doesn't really move the needle, but the big problem with plastic recycling is the economics of it, right? Is to, there's this feeling of being overwhelmed as to like, where do we start? How do we do it? How does it work financially? And I think with that model in the Dominican Republic, like you're showing how it could work.
Exactly. And so our view is, doesn't matter what you believe. If you dedicate funds to cleaning up a mess anywhere in the world, and if everybody contributed more dollars to clean up the mess in places that don't get any funding to do this, you don't need to be on either side of the aisle. You can guarantee that you will make some difference. And if everybody did this, there'd be enough funds to most likely clean up a lot of these areas that contribute to the majority of the plastic waste going in the ocean. So we really just wanted to boil down sustainability from our perspective to just how do we help direct the most amount of funds that we can, while also potentially saving our customers money on whatever it is they're buying, so that the capital burden isn't, too great to say, hey, this just doesn't work for us. Because that at the end of the day, that's the other most important thing. So if sustainability costs 4x or 2x or even 10% more, and it can't just be a part of, the normal way of doing business, you're not going to get the same adoption that if it can make financial sense on top of, being morally good.
No, that was the last two MJ BizCons. I felt like I had that conversation a lot, where it was, the difference of a penny, right? But I mean, per unit, that math makes, it's easy to do that math pretty quick.
Yeah. Oh, it adds up.
So could you tell me a little bit? So are you directly involved with the Ocean Recovery Group?
Yep.
What's your role there?
Well, directly involved. I mean, I'm not involved on a day-to-day basis. So we actually formed the venture with a company called 4G Recycling. So they're mainly an American-based, recycling company. So they manage, hundreds of trucks picking up waste from all different types of manufacturers. And this was really their concept as far as, hey, we want to spin up, this recycling facility. This was 5 years ago. The cost of recycled material was seeming to be, going through the roof at a certain point in time. There was a lot of talk around, if you have all of these PCR requirements, the Cokes and the Pepsis of the world, if the U.S. says you got to have 30% PCR in single-use plastic, there's just not going to be enough of it. So we kind of looked at the opportunity as like, okay, this is a place that should make financial sense. The sad part is that the price of recycled materials is just never really, picked up with inflation and how the price of everything else goes up. So, as much as we've tried to make this facility be a direct supply chain, kind of no-brainer from an economic standpoint, it's continued to be more of a, we fit it under the repurposed global model where without some additional capital coming in from brands to kind of support the entire thing, the entire, business structure, if you were just selling recyclables, is really hard to maintain.
Is that something that could change with economies of scale? If it got larger, would it be a little bit more efficient, easier to run?
Yes, I think the inherent issue that every recycler runs into, especially when you're talking about post-consumer, is it's really hard to collect post-consumer material and then create a very high value polymer, right? Like it's sorting is expensive. Any of the optical sorters that you see, it's when you have imperfections in any raw material and you're talking about injection molding or blow molding, if you have, foreign objects and material, it becomes really challenging to find use cases for it. So, what our biggest challenge and opportunity today is really figuring out, we have all this raw material. What are the proper end of life use cases that aren't as, obviously food contact stuff is a no-go. So you have building materials, you have all these other stuff that, if it's a thicker, less valuable product, you have a lot more leeway in what the inputs to that are without it being, an issue on the manufacturing side.
Is there any technology out there that you've kind of seen that could really shake up problems with sorting and making the recycling process a little bit more efficient?
I'm not close enough to give any examples of technology. I know, there's a lot of new chemical processes that help sort, by really like breaking down the different polymers, and you end up having different, densities and where the different material floats. It's one of those magic, there's a lot of investment into trying to figure out how you get all of this discarded plastic into something worthwhile. I don't think anybody has the exact answer today of what that's going to be. But from our standpoint, as long as the structure works where you can incentivize brands and, call it extended producer responsibility, if you will, but getting people to fund waste management infrastructure, if you're a big contributor to any type of plastic going into the environment, that's making enough of a difference regardless of, kind of where the material ultimately ends up. If it's not ending up in a waterway, to me is a better outcome.
Is it possible to achieve true sustainability without greenwashing?
I mean, it depends what, true sustainability means, right? Like to me, the most sustainable anything is like there's nothing, right? Like, but
Yeah.
there's nothing, you have no business, and we're in a consumer-based economy. I think if you were asking people how do you do how you run the most sustainable business nowadays, it's not thinking about what the material is alone. You're really thinking about where is the transit happening? Can I buy regionally, right? Can I be in a packaging format that comes from a geographic area that I'm already in? So you're cutting down on the shipping carbon footprint that is probably one of the largest polluters. And I think, if you're authentic as a brand and doesn't mean that you can't use plastic, but if you're using the least amount of material to still have a safe product, and you're really thinking about doing the least amount of disruptive behavior as far as getting your consumer packaged good on a shelf. I think just that in general is, could be considered sustainable, right? Like if you're making every decision based on what you think is, economically viable, but at the same time has a sustainable thought around it, to me that's really all you can ask, especially in the cannabis industry right now, people to do.
Do most cannabis operators have the time and resources to make that equation work for them? Or is it just quickest, cheapest?
I mean, man, right now it'd be hard to say that sustainability is a priority for any cannabis company. I mean, you have a lot of cannabis companies that it is their entire, ethos, right? Wild has done a great job. They've been extremely authentic in how they go about, and it seems like every opportunity they have to do something sustainable, to be sustainable, they are. PAX, the hardware company. They've partnered with, independently of us, they've partnered with Repurpose Global as well, and so I believe all their hardware is now plastic negative. Um, but for the most part, you survey, almost every MSO right now, if they had sustainability 4 years ago as a top priority, like really, if you really ask them, I don't think that anybody has the resources available to them today that can be a top priority when you're trying to just ensure that your margin profile is sustainable, your cash flow is coming in. Like it definitely falls to the bottom of the totem pole in this economic environment. But I do believe it, when the industry comes out of this and cooler heads prevail from a legislative perspective, that it's still a green industry, no pun intended. Like, the consumers are sustainable minded people. Like this industry more so than most has the consumer base that I think does actually care about sustainable and the brands that they support.
Any thoughts or predictions on when cooler heads might prevail from a legislative perspective?
Funny question in this week, right?
Yes.
If I was a betting man, I'd say not in the next 4 to 6 years.
Yeah.
I just I don't even know what change we're even asking for at this point. That's the crazy thing, right? Like, if you ask cannabis operators today, what is the top priority? It's probably just getting clarity on what the tariffs are, right? Like you wanted safe banking and you wanted rescheduling 3 weeks ago, but right now, like you don't even know, how much of the stuff are you importing is subject to 50 to 150% cost increase right now. So it's almost an order of operations thing. I think if the stability in the geopolitical tariff scenario is finalized, whatever it is, as long as it's just finalized and people can actually predict what the future holds for at least the next 18 months, to me, the next thing is really the banking and rescheduling. But it's even further down the pole on individual state level packaging rules and regulations.
For some for some of the clients that you work with on a daily basis, how are they navigating the current tariff situation? Is everyone kind of in a wait and see?
I think everybody's in wait and see. It's hard to not be. I think the biggest issues, in this individual week is, if you had production orders in China last week or last month and they're about to ship this week, I believe if it ships today, you're subject to a 10% increase. And if it ships on Friday, you'd be potentially an extra 50%, whatever it was. So this environment is challenging for orders that were in progress. But even for us, I mean, you can't plan, right? Is things going to pivot a week from now and the tariffs are gone in Vietnam when everybody, moved a lot of stuff out of China to Southeast Asia and Vietnam, for example. So I don't, to me, there's no real ability to plan. I think the only planning you can really do is evaluating your supply chain, understanding if you're very customized, glass jar is coming from China. Are you okay to put it in a bag or a plain jar with a label if the economic, situation on that jar 2X's, right? Like, I think that the only thing you can do right now is come up with contingency plans on if your packaging format is, for better or for worse, irreplaceable out of China, meaning just the supply chain over there, the labor that could be involved with it. If you can't move that from there, I think you have to understand what you would be okay, so that if you had to pivot, you're kind of ahead of it. And I think from there, it's just kind of a wait and see.
What is AE Global doing to help some of its clients and potential clients stay ahead of it?
Basically running that same exercise. What we're first doing, like in this 2-week period, we're doing an analysis of all of our, starting with our largest customers and working our way down. What products are coming out of China right now? Can those products be made anywhere else, even close to what they are stateside? If that answer is no, it's setting up conversations to say, hey, look, here's the worst case scenario of what we think the new tariff implications could be on this product line. One, gut checking. If that's the case, is this a non-starter? Because if it's a non-starter at that price point, we need to start looking at what are the other options that we can either make stateside or that are a little less costly, so that your commercial invoice is not as impacted by a new tariff if it's a lower cost material. Our only strategy is providing people options, right? We don't know enough about each individual product line to know what they can or can't absorb for cost increases, where the brand is positioned, and if the packaging is really the brand itself, or if this could be something that pivots. But our entire philosophy is, let's go and give people a good, better, best option when it comes to cost, and at least they're making their own economic decisions, rather than us just saying, hey, here's the new price. Sorry, we don't think that there's anything else we can do.
Well, Mike, I really do appreciate you taking the time today, man. And it's really been some incredible information that is very timely, unfortunately, very timely right now. But before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or your work at AE Global?
I think, this time more than ever, it's one of these moments that the industry seems to be always at each other's throats, right? But like now more than ever, I think people need to really think about collaborating, understanding how to leverage resources. There's on top of the lack of capital coming into the industry, there's all the other headwinds. So if nothing else, I think this is probably, from AE Global's perspective, we're looking to engage with as many people, even if we're providing consultative services on the Repurpose Global and the sustainability side. We are desperate to just get more people on this program, whether they were using us with Repurpose Global, whether they used a different company. We just want to incentivize more people to dedicate whatever excess, I use the word excess funds, which I know there's none of, but wherever you can find to make a contribution to sustainable, waste management infrastructure, we just believe is the strongest position you can have as a brand, without having anybody question your greenwashing. So I would say that's the most important.
No, I think when it comes to a cause, keeping plastic out of the water, that's kind of a no-brainer.
It's hard to argue with somebody if that's what they're trying to do, and
yeah,
you're pressed to find somebody to say, I think that's a bad idea.
That's right. More plastic in the water. More. Well, Mike, thank you again for taking the time, man. I hope we get a chance to do it again soon.
I appreciate it, David.
All right. Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You could also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right. For Mike Forenza, managing partner of AE Global, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News podcast, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.